Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's episode went over very well with the online chess cheating. I got a lot of feedback from that. A lot of people related to what I said, so I'm glad I'm not alone with that. I mean, it's unfortunate that cheating is so rampant, but anyway, if you have any thoughts or comments about that, there's still time to chime in, so send those in if you want to make the cut. I'm going to hold off on the emails about the online cheating episode for next week. That'll be part of next week's listener mailbag. So if you're just listening to that episode, you still have some time. For those who are not familiar, last week's episode was all about online chess cheating, and I gave some examples of the types of cheaters out there that I suspect are out there. So again, I would love to hear from you, info@thechessangle.com. Now, this week's episode and next week's, it's going to be a two-parter, is about chess teaching. And the idea for this episode came from one of our followers on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, I almost forgot to add this in my introductory remarks. I want to thank everybody for supporting the Chess Angle Podcast YouTube channel. We did surpass 1,000 subscribers, so I appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, definitely check it out. There's a link in the show notes. So 10,000 subscribers, here we come. Well, we'll see what happens, but all kidding aside, I really do appreciate it. That's kind of a big milestone for the channel, especially because it's not really video, it's kind of audio only. And I know YouTube is more of a video-based platform, which is probably why we don't have as many followers as we could, but that's okay. I'm thinking of maybe adding a video component, but even if I don't, it's what it is. And a lot of people use the YouTube channel for this podcast as sort of a road sign to go to the audio version, like on Spotify or whatever. So if that's what happens, it's served its purpose. If someone visits the Chess Angle Podcast YouTube channel and then follows us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it has served its purpose. So that's even more important than the subscriber count. But I do appreciate it, so it's a little bit more on the map. And thank you so much for your support. So getting back to my original thought here, the idea for this week's episode about chess teaching came again from one of our followers on YouTube, bluefin.64, and here's what he wrote. I've been considering trying to become a tutor for adult novices, so hearing about newer players' concerns is interesting. Although I've thought a lot about chess and chess improvement, it's been piecemeal. Unlike you, I haven't covered the entire territory in a comprehensive, organized way. So if you ever do a podcast on how to become a chess teacher, the do's, don'ts, and resources, I'd be quick to listen. Well, bluefin.64, you got your wish. That's a great idea for an episode. I'm actually going to break it up into two parts. This week, I'm going to give kind of an overview of chess teaching and some ideas on how to become a coach and what your philosophy should be. More of just a general viewpoint. Again, sort of your teaching philosophy, what I feel that should be. Next week's episode, I'm going to get more into the weeds as far as what concepts people need to know. And that'll be good, not just for chess teaching, but even players in general. But like I said, we're going to get into more of the teaching approach this week. And this episode is a follow-up to episode number 124, which was titled, Are Amateur Players Qualified to Coach Chess? And I argued that generally speaking, they are. So I'll put a link for that episode in the show notes. If you didn't hear that episode already, it doesn't matter. These are standalone episodes, so you can listen to this one first and always go back. But like I said, I'll link it up if you want to check it out. So again, this episode is going to be an overview of chess teaching, not a deep dive into every possible nook and cranny. And I'm going to discuss as far as chess teaching, specifically what a chess teacher should focus on and how one can become a chess teacher for beginners and developing players and beginning tournament players. But before we do that, let's go to our listener mailbag and hear what you had to say.
You've got mail.
Our first message is from Francois. It's a very thoughtful email. I did edit it just a bit. I'm sorry, Francois, but just for purposes of time and content, I did chop it just a little bit, but I think the gist of it will be there. And here's what he writes. Dear Neil, it's great to keep listening to your pod. After each episode, I'm eagerly waiting for the next one. Thank you so much for your time and dedication in producing such high quality chess content. Well, let me just stop there, Francois. I really appreciate that. That's really a big compliment, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. That really means a lot. So he continues, I have a simple and focused question that you will find at the end of this email, but I found that the context toward the question was more interesting than the question itself. I'm this type of guy who is more interested by the process than by the result. Explaining where the question comes from is also relevant because along the lines, it provides an improving tip that could be shared with your listeners. I'm a 38-year-old chess enthusiast from Brussels, Belgium, and father of two with a full-time job, who discovered the game 4 years ago and immediately fell in love with it. Your pod and the booming material about chess have contributed a lot to that, so thanks again. I could elaborate for hours on why chess is such a special game for me, but the prime reason is certainly the mystery around the fact that 32 pieces, 64 squares, and simple rules that hold on an A4 sheet of paper can generate so much complexity for a game that we will certainly not become a solved game anytime soon. Working in academia, I'm particularly interested in my relationship to knowledge and learning. When I started playing chess online in 2020, I was thinking that I could climb the rating ladder, as many beginners think, probably yet another manifestation of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and found that it took a much longer time than I anticipated. I'm now around 1100 chess.com in all time controls. Funnily enough, I enjoy equally playing on a 3-day format as well as 30-second bullet. That said, rating alone is not a goal by itself. I'm a strong believer in Goodhart's law. A measure that becomes a target ceases to be a good measure. I like instead to focus on two alternative and I think more robust metrics. Number one, the accuracy as estimated by the computer after the analysis. I consider that a game, even if it is won, is not a success if it has less than 80% accuracy. And number two, the fact that my advantage over the opponent is monotonously increasing. That is, that I win with the accumulation of incremental advantages rather than every player in turn blunders, resulting in a bumpy diagram. I prefer a game with a strong signal over weak noise than a game with a lot of noise, meaning ups and downs in the evaluation, that results in a random outcome because one of the players did not commit the last blunder. And he shows a few diagrams of the analysis from the game review. And then he continues, so I have played a couple of long time control games, 1 day and 3 day, by annotating all my thinking progress, and I found it a super effective way to improve. I played 7 games, won 4, drew 1, and have a clear edge on the ongoing 2 that remain. It's a time-consuming way to play, but the reward is incredible, as the obligation to justify all moves to oneself is contributing to building a good habit. I have the impression that it wires my brain to the correct way to play chess. I also think that this sort of annotated games is a great resource when I want to see a coach later to understand how I can progress. So my advice to your listeners is make the effort to play a few long games by writing down your thinking process fully. It will do miracles for your improvement. And now finally my question, as I find this process very effective and as I consider starting to play OTB soon, I have the question for the TD. Is a player allowed to take notes during a game besides writing down the moves? This would not only help me organize my thinking process during the game, but also learn from my errors after the game. Thanks, Francois. Well, Francois, thank you so much for that very thoughtful, very well-written email. And a couple of things there. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on improvement. Again, really, really thoughtfully written. And I love the fact that you're enjoying the process so much. That's really so important, because that's a trap, even myself, that we fall into, where we're so into and obsessed with improvement that we forget that we're supposed to enjoy it. So the fact that you're fascinated by the game, you're enjoying the game, that's great. That's really inspirational. That's a reminder for me as well, because we forget this is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be enjoyable. And it is, but it's very easy to just get caught up in reading and the idea that that's the only thing that matters. So thank you for that. Now, as far as annotating your games, you're absolutely right. It helps many people. A lot of strong, experienced coaches recommend you do that. Grandmaster Jesse Cry is kind of notorious for that. I mean, he'll spend upwards of 10, 15, 20 hours on one game just annotating his thoughts. Of course, at his level, it's different. Now, for myself, I just want to be honest, and I know I've said this before in the pod, I don't really do it that much. I'm more of a go straight to the engine type of guy. But technically, you're right. You should do that type of analysis first. I guess as I'm getting older and with my schedule, I guess I'm taking shortcuts. But you are correct. If you can write down your own thoughts and analyze without an engine and then go to the engine, it's certainly helpful. Now, for me, not only is it a time thing, I tried doing that, and I don't know, it didn't help me as much, but for many people, including yourself, it really does help. So you do what works for you, but I think that's fantastic advice. Now, as far as your question, I'm going by the US chess rules. You cannot take notes during the game. That's considered, I don't know if it's considered cheating, but it's considered like assistance. So you cannot take notes. The only thing you can write down are obviously the moves, and you can write down the timestamps. That you're allowed to do. That's not considered taking notes. So if an opponent took a long time, you can write down the time. And the whole idea is when you analyze the game, you can see how much time each opponent took. But other than the moves themselves and the timestamp, that's all you're allowed to write. Anything else would be considered like illegal assisting or note taking, and that is forbidden by the rules. I'm assuming FIDE has something similar. I apologize for not looking that up beforehand. Thank you again, Francois, for your very thorough, very enjoyable email, very inspirational. I appreciate it. Great to hear from you. Our next email is from Lee. He says, "Hi, Neil. Thanks for the podcast. I'm an avid listener and love the game. I'm 49 this year and struggling to get past 1200 rapid on chess.com. Two questions, really. First, have you done a show on a checklist before you move? As this, I think, is an area I could massively improve in. Secondly, do you think everyone has a chess rating ceiling, and no matter how hard they try, they could never pass it? I love this game and really want to improve. Love the podcast, by the way. Great show. Thank you so much for devoting your time to it. Lee in the UK." Well, Lee, thanks so much for the kind words. Glad you're enjoying the pod. And I really like these questions. Now, yes, I did do an episode specifically on a checklist. It was episode 15. It's called When It's Your Turn to Move. I will try to remember to link it up in the show notes, but it's episode 15 where I specifically discuss that. I'll give you just kind of the quick Cliff Notes version right now. It's basically a 4-step plan. The first thing, the very first thing, because your opponent just moved, what is the threat? What is he threatening? And do you need to defend against that? If there's no concrete threats, you then look for any tactical shots. Can you win a piece? Can you win a pawn? Is there a checkmate? Something like that. If you've determined there's no concrete threats by your opponent and then there's no tactics, which is probably going to be maybe 80% of positions, give or take, you then look for a plan or a positional idea. That's where you think more strategically. And then lastly, and this is the most important part, this is the part that we all forget, you have to do a blunder check. So you might come up with a plan or something like that. Well, if I go here, it's going to cover this square, but then you realize that hangs a piece. You have to check everything tactically and do a blunder check. So that's the 4-step process. I just gave you the ridiculously quick version. In the episode that I cited, I go through that much more thoroughly and in much more detail, so you can check that out. Your second question, which I really love, do you think everyone has a chess rating ceiling and that no matter how hard they work, they can't improve, like they can't pass it? That's a great question. That's probably a separate episode. I could probably do a 45-minute episode just on that. I really like this question. Tough to answer, and I don't know if it can be answered definitively. From a practical standpoint, yes, I think there is a rating ceiling, because if there weren't, everybody would be a grandmaster, right? And I know a lot of people work very, very hard and don't improve that much. And conversely, there are people who really don't study that much at all, and they have very high ratings and they soar. So it's very interesting. There's always exceptions, but for the most part, the people on the far right side of the bell curve, they tend to be the exceptions. Most of us are going to be on the high end, in the middle of the bell curve. So yes, from a practical standpoint, I think there is a rating ceiling. And when you factor in natural ability, natural aptitude for the game, you can argue that there's definitely a rating ceiling. And you also have to factor in memory and remembering positions. Like there are players, they can look at a position once or twice in a book or in a game, whatever it is, and they remember it forever, like a computer. Whereas other people, most of us who are mere mortals, have to go through that over and over again before it's imprinted on our brain. So there is a natural ability factor. Now, I will say this, what holds players back, in my opinion, often for their entire chess career, are these non-chess factors: nerves, composure, impatience, impulsiveness, laziness, things like that, more psychological things. And regardless of how much they study, they can't deal with these sort of non-chess issues, like these chess psychology issues. And as a result, they struggle for a long time. If you were to just give up everything and just study chess and do nothing else, would you improve drastically? Some would, some wouldn't, from what I've seen, because there are people I've heard who've done that, who have improved a lot. There are people who've done that who have improved only a little bit. So I think it's tough to give a definitive answer, but without me saying it depends, because everybody hates when you say it depends. Yes, practically speaking, I think you can only go so far. But I guess from a literal standpoint, you could argue that if you keep at it, the sky's the limit. But let's face it, I mean, most people, they're only going to get so much better. But I do feel everyone, this is important, everyone can absolutely get better to some degree. So I don't know about the whole ceiling thing. That's tough to answer. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. But I do believe everyone can get better, but they have to figure out what's not working. If they have a study plan, or if they have these issues, like I said, with chess psychology, like nerves, things like that, if they don't address those, nothing is going to change, right? It's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, but expecting a different result. Players really need to hone in on what's holding them back. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that when I get into the chess teaching later. So it's a very interesting philosophical question. That question, like, is there a limit to how much better someone can get? That would probably be a good interview or a group episode. Like if I had 2 or 3 guests on here, that would be like a good roundtable discussion, Lee. All right, because I feel like I'm not answering that as well as if this were like a group type thing. So I might keep that in mind for a future episode. Thanks so much, Lee, for your great questions. Our final email is from Brendan. He says, "Hello, my name is Brendan from Arizona. I recently started playing chess again at the beginning of the year. I had played a bit back in elementary school, but stopped playing and never really got back into it. I found your podcast recently and fell in love with the game all over again, as well as watched The Queen's Gambit last year. I was a bit late to the party on that show." Well, that's the beauty about Netflix, Brendan. You can watch it whenever you want. And I also really appreciate the compliment about the podcast. I'm really glad you're enjoying it. Anyway, he continues, "Recently, I have been playing a lot with the goal of reaching 1,000 online by the end of the year, after starting at around 300 at the beginning of this year. I recently just hit 920 with the help of stuff I learned from your podcast. Now to my question. I want to begin playing OTB and expanding my learning for the game. However, I have some scheduling issues. I am a junior in college studying engineering, work nights, and recently got married in the middle of this year to my wonderful wife. So, needless to say, I have a lot on my plate currently, which makes attending in person a challenge. I know you said in the past that playing OTB is the best way to learn, but for someone who is very limited in my time to attend one, are there any alternatives that you recommend while I work to free up time to go in person? Thank you for everything you do for improvers like me, and I hope you win your next game. Thanks so much, Brendan. Really appreciate the kind words and the fact that the podcast helped boost your rating so much that you saw improvement from a practical standpoint really means a lot. Glad you're enjoying it. And yeah, as far as attending OTB tournaments, it is a commitment. It's tough for some people based on their work schedule and their family situation. You really do have to, again, commit to it. And even if it's just once a week, that can be difficult for some people. You obviously have a very, very busy schedule since you're a college student. Until your schedule kind of frees up a little bit, I do have a few thoughts. First, some clubs do meet on the weekend. I don't know if your schedule is maybe a little bit lighter then. I know you probably have a lot of studying to do and things, but that might be an option if during the week it's just too crazy. And also, as far as playing in person, it might not be an over the board tournament, but try to find a friend that you can spar with. It's not quite the same as an over the board club, but at least you're playing in person and you guys can play some scratch games and then maybe analyze them. It's something. And hopefully, if it's a friend, you can both find time between your busy schedules where you can meet. I mean, it's something, it's a way to play over the board with another human. Also, look for casual meetups that take place when you're free. There are a lot of informal chess clubs at coffee houses, at restaurants, at libraries, and there's often some decent players there, so you could probably learn a lot. Usually there's at least, one or two that are usually really good, some in the middle, and then some who are just beginners. But if you can find an informal club, they might meet at an hour where you can kind of squeeze it in. Because I know attending a weekly club once a week for, let's say, 3 or 4 hours can be difficult. So with a more casual club, even if you stop by for an hour, that's something. So those are some ideas. But yeah, if your schedule is crazy, it is kind of tough to play a lot of over the board tournaments. Never mind once a week tournaments, even those weekend tournaments where you're basically giving up, your entire weekend, of course. So I understand that. But those are some ideas. Hope that helps. Thanks so much for your email, Brendan. We're now going to take a short break for a few messages, and we will get back to our conversation about chess teaching. So, as far as chess teaching, let's start with some general ideas. Let's start with what makes a good chess teacher. If you're looking for a chess coach, or if you want to be a chess coach, what should you look for? And a good chess teacher is really someone, and should be obvious, who's genuinely concerned about the student's improvement and enjoyment of the game, who really cares, who's genuinely concerned about their improvement and really tapping into the specific needs of that person. Obviously, a bad teacher would be someone who is just doing it because they think it's some easy money and, whatever, and that's all they care about. Unfortunately, there's a few out there like that. You want to avoid that, of course. Now, I know when I teach, I take it very seriously. I give the student notes and create an individualized study plan. Now, just some context, I'm not taking on students right now. I'm kind of focused more on my own improvement and the content creation stuff. It is something I want to get back into. I did it for a long time where I taught adult beginners, and it was more than just, okay, we do the lesson and that's it. Again, I would give them notes afterwards, email them what to study and what to work on and some things to think about. If they had questions, they could always text me or email me between lessons. And you want to look for an individualized, or you want to create an individualized study plan. You don't want it to be cookie cutter because every student needs different things. You need to explain to the student, a good teacher is going to do this, that they need to play a lot. They have to play. They can't just study and can't just have the lesson. They have to play a lot. And I would argue, especially when you're lower rated, is just very, very important because you're just going to clean up a lot of basic things. A good teacher, again, I mentioned this earlier, I alluded to it, is going to identify weaknesses and gaps in their game. That's one of the main goals. Like, what are you missing? What are the gaps? And we need to plug those holes. We need to fix that. Now, what I do for the first lesson, when I meet a student for the first time, I use what I call an assessment game. And it's a game I played many years ago where I was black. I played the French defense and it was a drawn game. But the reason I use that game, it has a little bit of everything. It wasn't one of those games where it was extremely positional or extremely tactical. It had a little bit of everything. It was positional, but it also had some tactical ideas. It had some end game ideas, opening ideas, development ideas, things like trading your undeveloped piece for your opponent's developed piece. There's just a lot of things going on as far as basic chess concepts that they need to know. So what I do with the first lesson, we look at this game and I basically say, okay, what do you think white should play here and why? Or, what I like to do is, okay, black played this move. Why do you think that move was played? Do you think it was good or bad? And from asking those questions, it's almost like my own version of an amateur's mind type thing. I can easily tell where the weaknesses are and where the erroneous, thought process is. That's something I do in a first lesson. Other people might do tactical things, but I like to use an actual game, ask them questions about the move, and then that helps me gauge where they're at and then create a roadmap for the lessons. So that's what a good teacher is going to do. A good teacher is not going to be someone where, oh, hey, how are you? Nice to meet you. So you want to look at one of your games or you want to look at one of my games? Like from what I've heard anecdotally, there are some teachers out there like that. You do want to have a plan. Okay. So that's just some general things about how I do it up front. Now, the other thing, what should you charge for the lesson? I know that's kind of a really practical, nitty-gritty thing. I don't want to get into specific numbers. I was thinking about this. That's going to be a little strange, but I mean, let's face it. Obviously, we care about the student. You want them to get better, but we're not going to do it for free. You obviously want to be compensated for your time. I mean, let's face it. That is something that's part of it. We do need to discuss that. Now, what should you charge? It should be based, I believe, on your experience, how long you've been doing this, your experience teaching, also your location, like the cost of living in your area, the going rate. Like for myself, I would probably charge like New York prices, that type of thing. Now here in New York, like for tutoring in general, I'm not just talking about chess, but any kind of tutoring like math, English, music lessons. I mean, it's pretty expensive, the going rate now, whereas in other areas that might seem like, a very, very large amount. So you got to keep in mind the sort of general tone of where you're at and what people are charging, because you don't want to overcharge, but you don't want to undercharge. Now, my good friend, Brian Caron, shout out to Brian. He's been on the podcast. He's a good friend. Brian is a full-time chess teacher. And as I'm saying his name, he probably should have accompanied me on this episode because he can probably share a lot about this. Maybe we'll do a follow-up, Brian, because you're due for another appearance. Anyway, but Brian, I believe it was you. Text me if I'm wrong. But Brian had posted something online. He made a great quote about this because this discussion came up a number of years ago. I forgot if it was on our Facebook page or some other chess site where someone was asking, like, what should I charge? And I like what Brian said. Your rate needs to be low enough that you're getting students to book lessons with you, but it needs to be high enough that you're motivated to teach the lesson and feel adequately compensated. So you don't want to undercharge, especially. Like, I'm just very big on the compensation should be commensurate with the task. So again, your rate needs to be low enough that you are getting students, but it needs to be high enough that you feel that you're being compensated fairly. So you got to find that sweet spot. All right. But I think many people who go into this, they do actually undercharge. Or what you could do, if you don't feel comfortable, you could start on the lower end. And then as you develop and gain more students and more experience, you can always raise your rates. That's very common, that type of thing. I don't want to get too much into specifics. I just wanted to kind of give a very basic thought about, how you should price your lessons, but there's a lot of factors at play there. Now, let's talk about the minimum rating to teach, because that's something else. Like, should amateurs teach lessons? And if they do teach lessons, should there be a minimum rating for them to do that? That's kind of a controversial thing. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to read something from Reassess Your Chess. It was a letter written to Jeremy Silman about this very topic and his response. So I'm going to read that now. How to Reassess Your Chess, 4th edition. I have the hard copy in front of me. It's big. It's like a doorstop. It's like Silman's Endgame course. And the title of the letter is called Teaching Chess to Children. However, this certainly applies to teaching chess to pretty much anybody, whether it's adults or children. And here's what the question was from the reader. He says, I have a question regarding teaching chess. I'm very interested in giving students and beginners private lessons and originally felt it most appropriate to wait until I achieve an expert rating, but I really have the urge to teach now. Right now, I'm in the 1700s USCF, and my rating is on an upward spiral. I feel I can certainly help beginners and young kids with the basics, develop an opening repertoire, tactics, etc. In addition, I am a public school teacher by day, so I have plenty of experience working with kids. My thinking is that once the student achieves a Class C rating, the parent can decide if he or she should then study with someone higher rated. Do you feel it's appropriate for me to take on young students and beginners interested in entering tournament chess or hobbyists, or am I correct that it's really not appropriate until I'm an expert? I value your input very much. There seems to be conflicting opinions on this. And here is Silman's response. He says, conflicting opinions. Well, there are always conflicting opinions among people that don't have a clue. So try to discount those that couldn't teach a dog to bark, but love to speak, and strong players who love to put themselves on a pedestal. If you look at the various scholastic programs, you'll find that the vast majority of teachers are in the 1400 to 1700 range, and that's perfect for kids rating-wise. When you want to teach children, there are a couple things that are far more important than a player's rating. Do you have the patience to teach young children? Are you a natural-born teacher, able to communicate in a simple, clear, and entertaining fashion? Do children feel comfortable around you? It's also important to understand one great truth. A high rating, expert master, or even grandmaster doesn't mean a person can successfully share his knowledge. It doesn't mean he can write, and it doesn't mean he can teach. Teaching calls for a specific skill set, and teaching children calls for a skill set all its own. I remember a gentleman in the San Francisco Bay Area who was quote-unquote only rated 1500, yet he taught chess for years at a junior college. He might still be at it, and was widely respected as a very, very good teacher. Even players who were considerably higher rated than he was attended his classes. In fact, I attended one of his classes and was very impressed. So your thoughts about having to be an expert before you teach is simply wrong. Trust me when I say that you already have the goods. Experience with children, experience with teaching, and a solid 1700 rating. And lest I forget, it also seems that you have a passion for it, a real desire to share your love of chess with young people. Sounds to me like you're a natural. Go out there and teach, and don't let anyone tell you differently. So that's an I am, even saying that, you can't always go by reading. Very interesting. Now, even though it was about teaching chess to children, because you may say, why are you reading this? We're talking probably more about teaching adult improvers. I still think it's applicable. And his whole point about, are you a natural born teacher? Can you communicate? Do you feel comfortable teaching? And where he says that a high rating doesn't always correlate with good teaching skills. He mentioned this player rated 1500 who was a highly respected chess teacher. So I thought that was a very interesting article or letter, and it kind of fits into what we're talking about here. Now, I do have one little bit of an issue with Silman's response. If I'm nitpicking, he didn't quite answer the question, because the reader's question was about private lessons, And his response seemed to be more about teaching scholastic chess or teaching in the schools. And yeah, for teaching in the schools, like teaching groups of kids or classes, rating really doesn't matter. In fact, there are many schools that have chess programs where they'll have a classroom teacher do it who barely knows the game, like he or she is a beginner themselves. And that's fine. In many situations, that's fine because the kids are playing, they're learning, and that's okay in that context. We're not talking about like an all-star competitive high school chess team. But for many just basic school programs, that's okay. But when you're talking about private lessons, I think at least a peak rating of about 1600 US chess, your over the board rating, is what it should be, because lower than that, I think you're still having issues with your own game. There's probably some wiggle room there. All right. Maybe, who knows, maybe if you're 1400, 1500, but you're a really good teacher, you can work with a beginner. I'm just giving sort of a loose estimate from my own perspective. Now, the exception would be, if you're teaching a complete rank beginner, because there are some adults in that situation who want lessons, like they don't even know how the pieces move or they just learned how the pieces move, then maybe the rating doesn't matter so much. But if you have an adult who's a little bit more than a beginner or an advanced beginner who's maybe approaching intermediate, maybe they're already rated like 1300 or so, then yeah, I think at least a peak rating of 1600. But again, that's kind of a loose, I'm not putting like a firm declaration on that. I'm just sort of thinking out loud. Now, next thing, from a practical standpoint, how many students should you take on, right? Do you want to take as many students as are interested? Do you just want to take a few? This, of course, has different meaning depending on if you're doing this as a side hustle with a full-time job or if you want to be a full-time chess teacher. Now, a full-time chess teacher pretty much has to take them when they want, I would imagine, because that's their livelihood. Whereas if you're doing this as a side hustle, you can be much more selective. You can say, and this is like how I would do it if I go back to it. You can say, all right, I'm only taking 2 students a week, or I'm only taking 3 a week, whatever it is. And then if your schedule frees up, you can take more. And in that situation, you set the schedule and time slots. If you don't do that, everyone's going to try to finagle it around their own schedule. You have to say, okay, I'm only taking 3 students. I have, 2 slots on Monday, late afternoon at this time, and 1 on Saturday morning. That's all I have available. It has to be one of those. And if they can't do it, that's it. Because what happens is if you sort of acquiesce and do it at a time that's really not comfortable for you, you're not going to enjoy the process. So, you can do that as a teacher, even if it might cost you some students, because again, if you're doing it as a side hustle with a full-time job, you kind of have to make those time blocks, so to speak, and just basically say, this is when I'm free, like wherever you post it on a website or whatever it is. Now, the next thing, do you teach in person or on Zoom or online or both? It's really up to you. It depends on your situation. If your house is kind of chaotic, there's a lot going on, well, that's probably not a good location. You can go to the student's house, but do you really want to do that? It depends. And then if you do travel to the house, are there going to be limitations on how much you travel? You got to think about these things. At this point, for me, I would only teach online at this point. And the truth is, many students, particularly adults, they actually prefer that. Obviously, having it online, it's much more convenient for everybody. There's no commuting. Many working professionals, they really like that because they can do it from the office. Let's say it's the end of their workday, but they go home and whatever, they have kids, the house is kind of crazy. They might want to do it in the quiet of their office before they go home. An online lesson allows that type of flexibility. So what I find is not just for the teachers, but even the students, a lot of them prefer that as well. Now, one thing you have to determine is, do you want to teach kids, adults, or both? Now, Bluefin, who prompted this episode, I know he was talking about teaching adult beginners, but it is something you should think about, because if you advertise yourself as a chess teacher, parents are going to be interested for their kids. Now, for me personally, and we're talking about chess lessons specifically, at this point, I would only want adult students. I would want adult beginners, advanced beginners, beginning tournament players. That's all I would want to teach at this point. But I will tell you now, let's say I start advertising again. I'm not ready to do that now, but let's say I get to that point. I get to a place in my life where I want to go back to taking on some students because I do miss it. If I advertise it, even if I say it's only for adults, I'll still get parents message me. They'll be like, I know you said it's only for adults, but I really want my child. You'll still get that, which is fine. So something to be aware of. Now, teaching kids chess, and again, we're not talking about teaching kids in general. We're talking about private chess lessons. When you teach kids in that context, it can be challenging because if you do it online, like an adult should be with them, or do you not do it online, right? And a lot of times with kids, they squirm. You also have to think about, are you going to get some like pushy parents who are going to make you uncomfortable? Now, my experience, I don't teach kids anymore chess, but when I did, the parents were generally awesome. Now, I did have one parent where he kept saying, I just want you to teach him advanced moves. I want you to teach him advanced moves. Because he had come to the club and he saw some tactic I played. He's like, yeah, I want you to teach him those kind of moves. Meanwhile, his son was like hanging pieces, had no idea of even the most basic tactical patterns. And I tried to tell him that. I ended up not taking him as a student. Now, that was very rare where I had a situation like that, but that's something that you need to keep in mind if you take on children as students. Also, you want to be careful if a parent or even an adult says something like, yeah, I'm like 800 now. If I take lessons, can you get me to like 1,200 in 2 months? Things like that, when they put a number on it, you need to run from that because it just doesn't work that way. Now, it's not a bad idea, and a lot of teachers do this, to sort of vet students before scheduling a lesson. You could just have like an email exchange or even speak to them, like just to kind of get an idea. I usually just send something like, just give me an idea of what you're looking for. And if I feel it's, someone who's genuinely concerned about getting better and who's interested in the game and who, really enjoys it, that's someone I would want to take on. But if it's someone who's going to say, well, I need to get this rating by this amount of time, you got to be careful with that. So these are just some things to keep in mind. So for me personally, I would only take on adults at this point. And if I do go back to it, it would be, limited for me. I would take on, just maybe 2 or 3 students a week at the most. And I would have to time block it for, a specific day and a specific time. And I would basically have to say, this is what I have available. If that's not going to work, I can refer you to another teacher. Like, that's the way to do it. All right. So we're at about 45 minutes-ish. So I'm going to call it for this week, but there's going to be a part 2. I just don't want this to be like 90 minutes. I don't know why people do that. Like, really? Like, who wants to listen to a podcast for 90 minutes or 2 hours? Not me. Anyhow, I'm going to cut this, and next week's episode will be like around the same time, maybe a little bit less. What I'm going to discuss next week are specific teaching materials. Like, okay, we talked about how to structure the lesson, some thoughts on what you should charge, whether you should do it online, whether you should teach adults. We talked about just some general sort of administrative things. Next week, we're going to get into what you teach. Okay, so you're now here with the student face-to-face or you're online. What do you teach? What do you use? What are some materials that I recommend both for the lesson and for homework as part of their study plan? So stay tuned next week for the continuation of this topic on chess teaching. But keep in mind, even if you're listening to this as someone who is not interested in teaching lessons, what I'm going to discuss next week are going to be a lot of concepts that I think are essential for people to know, and I am going to focus more on adult beginners. So even if you don't want to teach, you may want to hear some of the concepts that I believe are essential and that you need to know to become a competent tournament player. So even if you don't use it for teaching, you may want to use these ideas for yourself. So I will go over those resources and materials next time. Looking forward to that. Really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.